Thank you guys so much for being on here. And for everyone watching now, and if you're watching this later, also hi. We're going to post this on our page. This is our first one, but we'll be doing more of these. Jody's on, and in future ones, we'll sort of have a Q&A back and forth together, and we'll just go over different parts of our business and our life. But for today, we are going to do a quick studio tour of just a few highlights, and then go through questions that I get asked all the time about our work and our business, and then any questions that come up. So before we get into it, just a quick little story. The reason we are just doing a mini tour today is because everything in this studio space, almost everything, has a story behind it or some significance to it. And that actually ties into our design philosophy that Jody really lives by. And she talks about this a lot on her blog, Groundswell by Joe, that we contribute to together. It actually started out as a book that turned into a blog, and it's all about empowering people to get in touch with their creative instincts and figure out how to design their own spaces themselves. And so this foundational idea is that if you select pieces individually that you gravitate towards, that speak to you, regardless of color or style or era, they will sort of magically kind of work together. And the reason being is because they come from you. So rather than approaching design from this really zoomed out view and being overwhelmed by the pressure to have everything look streamlined or fit a certain aesthetic or trend, almost like an Instagram profile where everything just looks so seamless, zone in on the individual items that you really admire. And I think we've all had moments, whether we feel creative or not, walking down the street, seeing an item of clothing or an art piece, or even just a color that just like grabs us and brings something out of us instinctually before even thinking about it. And so that's the sort of feeling that you want to train yourself to listen to and get used to when you're designing your spaces and making pieces. There's this quote that I read this week by Hemingway talking about writing a novel. And he talks about having writer's block and not knowing where to get started. And what he says, paraphrasing it, is if you start with one true sentence, something that you know to be true, the rest will come, and you just go one by one and a story develops from there. And I really think the same is true for any creative pursuit, including design. So I just love that, and I think it's just completely relevant. So the idea is pick one piece if you're starting that you love, that you're inspired by, and the rest will come from there. And so this actually leads to a question I get a lot, and a question that I received yesterday, which is, where do you start? So especially when it comes to a rug, do you have your room planned out and then find something that fits in? Or do you try and select that piece first and then design everything around it? And for us, of course, the rug is the focal piece of the room. And it really is a wonderful place to start. And if you can create a custom rug, that's even better because you can completely infuse your own preferences into that and build everything around it. So that's our perspective. So I'm going to get started just with the main room and the entrance. And then we'll go into some of our collection and our pieces and more questions and any questions that come up. So starting here is actually a model that I built and photographed. I was still in engineering school at the time and really desperate for some creative freedom. And so I did my tech internship for 2/3 of the summer and then went to London and took an interior design course at the Central Summer Test School. And it was just a much needed, wonderful experience. I'm going to bring you into the main space. We have a painting here by my great aunt, Jody's aunt, that we just love. The colors are beautiful, the energy is beautiful, and it just adds so much to the space. This is a shelving unit and also a lighting unit, and you'll see light is a huge theme in this space. And it was built and designed by a friend of Jody's named Mara Morel, who's actually based in Spain now. And it originally was a full desk. So a desk came out all the way, and that's where our printers and fax machines were stored, which of course we don't need anymore. And the material is super interesting because it's actually mouse pad material. It's hard to see on video, but back in the day, in the 90s, mouses needed mouse pads to work. And so, of course, rather than ruining the design aesthetic and having an extra layer on top of a desk, they thought, why not make the whole thing into a mouse pad desk and shelving unit? So it's really cool. And it's actually a really simple piece. The shelving itself is a translucent plastic material, and the lighting is just colored bulbs, and you can put any color in there. We have actually never strayed from the red, orange, yellow, and white because we love the effects so much, but it can easily be changed out and change the entire feel of the space. Here we get into more lighting. This was actually a piece designed and made by Jody. The original inspiration came from a collaboration that we had done with Swarovski for a rug. So we embedded Swarovski crystals into the rug, and she had a ton of these crystals left over and wanted to repurpose them and make something completely new. So if you can see, there are all of these individual little crystals overlaid with the LED lighting, and that is wrapped with the wire. And so this, over the past 5 or 6 years, has actually turned into its own sort of spin-off brand called Remix by Groundplans, and we make lighting pieces, jewelry, using all found objects, and we make custom pieces using family heirlooms, anything that's sort of left over. Everyone has one earring that's gone missing and a spare one left over, or an old brooch from a grandmother that they don't necessarily want to wear, but maybe want to hold on to in a different way. So, yeah. Next, we get into these gold panels, and these are a huge feature of the space. A friend of Jody's, was a designer friend, was selling these empty frames at a flea market locally, and really had no intended use for them. So Jody's idea was to take these completely empty frames, find someone in New York City that would be able to put the wood mounting on the back, and then fill them completely with gold leaf. And this idea actually comes from, if you've ever been to rooms at the Met or other museums of 17th century rooms in France or Spain, the walls are gilded. And the reason for this is, of course, they didn't really use electricity, and at night they had candlelight, and the metallic gold reflected this light and added immense warmth to the room. And you can even see as I move around how the light picks up on it, both from our natural lighting and from the colored lighting pieces. And you can see that glow. And at first, when she started this project, I thought she was insane, because if you've ever worked with gold leaf, it is extremely challenging. She started out with imitation and did not like how it looked, and then switched into the real thing. And you can see sort of the individual square panels, and each one had to be carefully spray glued and placed and brushed. And it took ages, but it's super impressive, and I no longer question it. So next we get into more lighting. We have this chandelier and some matching sconces here. I'm gonna dim the light a little bit more so that you can really see them. And these Jody and I found in a flea market in Nice when we were there about 6 years ago. The French are famous for their flea markets, and especially this one. It takes place in a square where Matisse actually had his studio. It looked out onto it, and it's just a beautiful space with some real treasures. And we fell in love with these lighting pieces. But of course, it was not easy to get them into here. We spent, I think, almost a year working with our freight forwarders that we used to import our rugs to get this shipped over. And so each crystal had to be taken off and individually wrapped and crated over. And in addition, once it got here, we needed to rewire it to the American system. And we also had to do a little bit of rewiring in our own space here. So a lot of times you'll see actually with chandeliers, there's a wire that comes down and then connects to the wall rather than channeling through the ceiling. And sometimes it'll have a chain wrapped around it or some velvet to spruce it up. But that did not fit with our aesthetic. So we had that electrical wired through the ceiling and a little bit into the wall. And fun fact, Jody said, why don't you patch it up? So do the drywall and the sanding and painting and try it out and see what happens. So I spent about a week doing so, and it was a completely new challenge, but I think it looks pretty good. Yeah, so some other quick pieces in here. We have our Saarinen table from Design Within Reach, which is just one of my favorite pieces of furniture ever. It's so elegant and just perfectly proportioned. The Noguchi table, of course. Our couch is from ABC Carpet and Home. white or cream velvet may not be obviously the most practical choice, but it's held up really well and it's beautiful. Our Eileen Gray table and wound chair here. And of course, we have our rug. And this was actually part of Jodi's first collection. So she had spent years studying in Japan under a national living treasure who was a pioneer in the arts and crafts movement. And after that, returned to the United States, came to San Francisco, and studied under Rudolf Schaefer, another pioneer in the crafts movement, and there started her own textile company for home furnishings called Pika Prints. That was the first business. And then came back to New York and decided to start her own collection of rugs. And the inspiration was to break down the boundaries that existed at that time when it came to rug design. So traditionally, you had either an antique rug or it was a traditional sort of pattern with a border. And that was really all that existed, all that was out there. And she had been immersed in this completely foreign culture in Japan, which at the time was even less exposed to the outside world, and was exposed to just a different way of thinking. And so she had the idea to come up with a collection of designs that related to the floor, that were photorealistic or had a trompe l'oeil effect, and added some real dimension and to a space. So you can see with this one, it's actually a hand-tufted rug, and it's hand carved. And so you can see it actually is literally three-dimensional. And it's so lush, and the detail is just incredible. And for her first few samples before finding a factory, she actually had to tuft them herself to show exactly what she intended. And started out with factories here in the United States, and then eventually moved to a factory in France that really was just a master in this type of work. So zooming out again, you can just see how realistic this is. This is spring blossoms floating on water. So yeah, I'll take us over to where we have some of our samples and start going over questions. We will get into all of our different collections, and we can talk through processes, but I'll just sort of give an overview for now. So we have our children's samples here from our children's collection, some collaborations we've done with different artists and friends. Beautiful mohair. One of the questions I actually got was, where do you source your materials? And it can be a challenge. I mean, we'll work with factories that have their own sources, but there are times when you have a vision of what you want to create, and it doesn't necessarily exist yet. And this is an example of that. So Jodi had seen more traditional ushak rugs coming from the Middle East that used mohair, but you'll probably have seen something with a pattern and a lot of design to it. And she noticed how beautiful the raw material was, and decided to see what that could look like if it was just one solid color, and really highlight then the texture and the sheen of it. And you can see this is mohair, but it almost looks silky, and it's so, so plush. So this took years to develop, this kind of quality, and the amount of washing that was needed, and the number of knots. This is a hand knotted rug. The color, this one is actually dyed, but we have some natural mohair as well. And so she had to source the yarn from one continent and have it shipped over to a factory on another continent. And that was the sourcing process. And she was extremely involved in that, with all of the parties involved. And now we have this incredible quality that you really don't find anywhere else. So, yeah. This is a sample from the Swarovski collaboration I was referring to earlier. Super subtle, but just gives a really cool effect. We have some more samples from that first collection, rocks, which you'll see also have that incredible carved three-dimensional effect. And it's just, it really is incredible. This is autumn leaves. We have a photo in full of this on our Instagram that you can see. And just to talk a little bit about the process, the most number one question I get is, what is the process from start to finish? Where do you begin when you're making a custom rug? Because most of our work, a majority of our work, is custom. And so that comes down to everything from selecting colors to materials, size, of course, pattern. There are a lot of different factors. So the way we start is clients will usually have some inspiration piece. So this goes back to what I was talking about before, but they'll maybe have something that they just gravitate towards that that inspires them. And they're not sure how that translates, but that's a starting point. And for designers that we work with, they have more of an ability to take all the pieces in a room together, bring the wood elements and the paint and the different fabrics they're using, and already create sort of a palette to work with for our rug. So as referenced, we have so many different kinds of textures. Of course, we have this thick plush hand tufted that I was referring to. You'll see this backing has latex on it, or you can go much thinner with a hand knotted quality rug, and this can be cut as this is. It can be all wool, or you can introduce some silk elements. It can be silk blended with the wool, so the yarn is actually blended together, or you can just have accents like you have here. You can have another kind of effect where you have loops, and then we do something called tip shearing. So basically it's brushed over and cut, and anything that's higher will be cut down. So you get this effect of almost having two colors and a much more varied texture than the pattern itself actually conveys. So first step, pick your quality. Simultaneously, we of course have such an emphasis on color. So I pulled out some of the palms that we've put together for different client projects. So what we'll do is a client will either have a fabric swatch, as I mentioned earlier, or we work with Pantone colors. So I have a huge book at the front, but here we have a book of uncoated Pantone chips, with which most designers have on hand, and they can easily reference a color and send it over to us. So we'll start there, and then based on that, pick maybe 10 different palms or so for each color, so that they can really get a sense of what that will look like in a yarn form. And we'll talk them through the different ways of looking at it. As I mentioned, you can have this cut view, you can have a looped view, you can have the combination with the tip shearing, and that really, there's many options. So once we narrow it down, you'll see here we had a bunch of different tones and shades, and we'll narrow it down to a selection. And we will then work on a design or have a quality picked out, and take little pieces of each palm, so a few threads of yarn, and create a yarn sheet, and we'll send that actually physically to our factory, and they will then dye the yarn to match perfectly. So to make sure we're on the right page, they'll make a sample, so like these that I showed you that are just about 1 by 1 or maybe a little bit larger, and that will give us something to really review in person with our client, that they can show other stakeholders, to make sure that we really got the design intent correctly. And yeah, so that's pretty much the process. Once that's all signed off, we go into production, and it can take a few months because most of what we produce is handmade, and it's made by individuals weaving together in a mill. So it does take some time, and it takes a lot of care. And then we'll have it shipped over. We have a group of installers that we work with, that we trust, and they will do the spread or the install, whether it's wall to wall, which is a little bit more labor intensive, a staircase, or just an area rug that just gets laid down. Another question I received is, how can I ensure the longevity of a rug? And this is a great question, and a really important one, because there are a few things you can do. So the number one thing is to always have a pad under a rug, and this serves a few purposes. The first, that's most obvious, is with slipping. So it'll be usually like a rubbery or some kind of friction inducing material, so that you can walk safely and you won't be sliding around. But it also provides protection. So every time you're stepping on that rug, you are wearing it to some extent. And with the padding underneath, it just provides a layer of support, so that the rug isn't just being sort of trampled on, but there's this extra support underneath it, and that will really extend longevity. And you can see when rugs don't have padding, the ends will start maybe fraying a little bit, or certain high traffic areas will be more like indented or have an imprint, and the padding just keeps everything sort of uniform. And then one other thing we do is something called fiber guarding or stain guarding. So there are certain formulas that can be applied to a rug. Our installers usually do this for most of our projects, and this creates sort of a layer of protection over it. It doesn't alter the feel or appearance or color or anything, but it coats the fibers so that they're more resistant to stain. So it doesn't mean they're impermeable, but it means that maybe you have a little bit more time after you spill something, if you don't have a chance to pick it up right away, that it won't set into the fibers. But one thing that's actually really cool about using natural materials, which is something that we really emphasize for environmental reasons primarily, we work pretty much exclusively with wools, mohairs, silks, jutes, there are a lot of different materials you can use, but it's really important for our business to be sustainable. A lot of man-made materials, even in our clothes, off gas, they're really bad for the environment. And the craziest thing is they don't even last as long, and they don't have the natural protection that that natural materials have. So when it comes to wool, if you've ever seen a sheep get wet, which you might not have, but even if you've had like a wool sweater, you'll notice if it gets wet, the droplet will sort of gather on top of it. So it doesn't immediately like seep in. And that's because of something called lanolin, which is naturally present in wool. And lanolin is a natural repellent in a way, nature's repellent. So that's what makes wool so much easier to clean than really any other material. Yeah, so I think for today, we'll stop here, but I so appreciate everyone tuning in. We are open to any more questions, and I would love to answer more questions, and I would love to have Jody answer more questions because she has so much experience and different perspectives on the process and design. And yeah, so please send them in and tune in for the next time, and we'll let you know when we're doing our Q&A and the next part of our tour. So thank you guys.